Thanks everyone for coming to this ESCoE economic measurement webinar. We're absolutely delighted to have Professor Thomas Crossley, who will be talking about studying consumption behavior using open-ended text questions. Tom Crossley is a research professor at the University of Michigan and a co-director of the panel study of income dynamics. He's also a long-term collaborator friend of mine. We're also really delighted to have Ellis Monahan, who will be giving a discussion today from the Office for National Statistics. Tom's going to be talking for 40 minutes, then there'll be 20 minutes for discussion, and we'll have 15 minutes for general Q&A. To ask questions, it's probably best if you put them in the Q&A chat box. You can put the questions in during the talk, and we'll come to most of them at the end, but if there are clarifying questions, I might interrupt Tom and pose them to him. Yes, we're especially grateful to have Tom because he's up bright and early in Michigan, and also I see some of his colleagues stateside have also joined, so really great to have them here as well. But apart from that, I'll leave things over to you, Tom, except to say one thing, which is that this event is being recorded as well, though I should mention as well. But over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Peter. And thank you to ESCoE for the opportunity to speak to everyone today about this work. I have a sort of a subtitle, which is "What would you do with 500 pounds in your own words?" which, for those of you who know the literature on the elicitation of marginal propensity to consume, is an obvious allusion to a recent paper in the Review of Economic Studies by Fuster, Kaplan, and Savard, and I'll come back to that. So this is, I should say, this is joint work with Peter, who you've just met, the chair, and Sophia Sarah Vasquez, who's a very fine PhD student at the European University Institute. This is the first time, I believe, that any of us have presented this work. It's brand new. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about it, and anxious to get feedback and comments. So let me start. I'm going to, because I have 40 minutes, and I want to make sure that I don't intrude on the time of the discussion or the Q&A, I'm going to kind of go through an overview first and preview the results, try to give you a sense of what the question that we're trying to answer is and what we find, and then I'll get into the details as time allows. Okay. So I think, you know, the starting point, at least for me on this project, is a very big question, and it's a question that's on my mind a great deal because, as Peter just mentioned, I've recently moved to the University of Michigan, where I've become a co-director of the panel study of income dynamics, which many of you will know is a very long-running household panel study, a sister study to Understanding Society, or the former BHPS. PSID has been running since 1968. And when we think about what data surveys collect, a lot of the time, the discussion over the last couple of years have been about domains, and particularly, you know, and so these discussions came up when I was also helping to run Understanding Society, but also when I was an ONS fellow. I'm part of the Economic Experts Working Group, a discussion around, you know, in an environment where we have lots of naturally occurring data, lots of admin data, for example, you know, what should surveys try to collect? That's not what I'm going to talk about today, but I'm going to talk about another question that has to do with changes in technology, changes in the environment, and what they imply for what surveys should do. And what I want to focus on today, or what motivated the project that I want to tell you about today, is thinking about, in this environment, what kind of data or what kind of question types should surveys use? Okay. And what I mean by that is specifically is, you know, there are closed format questions and there are open format questions. You know, so a closed format question is a question that, you know, asks your income, you know, or gives you a choice of several categorical responses. Okay, and these kinds of questions have been long favored, I think, especially by economists. I can think of, you know, many discussions of survey design over the course of my career where we thought about the alternative, about open format questions, where you ask people an open-ended question and they're going to give a textual response, you know, describe your job. You know, my reaction to those in the past always, well, what would you do with the answers? And so I think closed format questions are typically favored because they produce quantitative data, and it's sort of obvious how you would do statistical analysis. Open format questions, how would you react? When we look at open format questions today, like how would you react to some extra income, in your own words, have, I think with some exceptions, been seen as useful more for exploratory or qualitative work, small studies, pilot studies, but not for large surveys and that produce data for statistical analysis. I think the important exception that I'm aware of is occupational classification. So, in the PSID, we collect textual descriptions of people's jobs, and then those are coded into occupations, and that's a long-standing practice. But although we don't use open format questions that much, they have some advantages. And so I think two big ones that really motivated us here is, one is that they allow respondents to cite considerations that the designer of the surveys might not have thought to query, right? So we can only ask sort of closed format questions about things that we can imagine, and open format questions allow the possibility of learning about things that are not in our priors. And the second thing is that open format questions avoid priming respondents to particular responses. So if we give a set of response options, many respondents in an attempt to cooperate will choose one of those responses. And an open format question, doesn't prime them in the same way. Okay, so there are these two, big disadvantages that, or these big advantages, I'm sorry, that we are not taking advantage of when we don't use open format questions. So what's the idea? So the idea here is just that, the developments in text analysis, in the methods of analyzing text have increased the utility of open format questions. And this increasing ability to analyze the responses to open format questions or text in general at scale is likely to continue and get better. And this ought to shift the optimal mix of question types. If we have a better ability, the limitation of open format questions has always been what to do with them, the expense of coding. As that as those costs come down, it's going to make open format questions a more attractive proposition. And so what we wanted to do in this project is kind of explore that idea with a particular application. And the application that we're interested in is measuring and understanding consumers' marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so the marginal propensity to consume is a really important parameter in macroeconomics. There's been a huge literature. There's a paper, which I'm not sure whether it was made available, but I'm happy to make it available to anybody who's interested, where we give lots of credit to that literature. I won't, given the time available, I'm not going to survey the literature, but there's a very large literature that tries to study the marginal propensity to consume and measure it. And there have been puzzles that emerge in that literature, which I'll come on to. And so we want to use that as a test case to see if we could make better use of open format questions. Okay, and I think text analysis is a growing field in macroeconomics, but it's largely focused on the words of policymakers and not the words of consumers. So we'll be different today in that we're focusing on the words of consumers. And it's largely focused, I think, on naturally occurring text, transcripts of, for example, monetary policy committees, adverts, job vacancies, and less so on design data collection. And so here we're thinking about, design data collection. We design a survey, but we use open format questions. And I guess the other example that's like this is the Ferrario and Stancheva work on redistributional preferences. Okay, so our test case is the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume measures how a consumer would change their spending in response to an unanticipated transitory income gain or loss. And it's a key parameter for the calibration of macro models. A large MPC is critical to many Hank models. It's the parameter that helps us think about targeting stimulus payments, how much of a fiscal stimulus we would get from a particular stimulus payment. It helps us understand insurance against shocks and pass-through to consumption. And because we think, the kind of standard consumer model would tell us that, consumers who are in comfortable financial circumstances with high levels of liquidity should smooth transitory income shocks, whereas consumers in straitened financial circumstances may have much higher pass-through of transitory income shocks to spending. If we can learn about the distribution of the marginal propensity to consume in a population, we can also learn about the prevalence of tightened financial circumstances. So it's been a very, a much studied parameter, but measurement of the marginal propensity to consume for a variety of reasons is very difficult. And as a result, there has arisen a number of literatures that try to recover this parameter. There are papers, and here I'm just giving seminal examples based on natural experiments of tax refunds, for example. There are papers that try to use covariance restrictions on panel data on income and consumption to back out what the marginal propensity to consume is. But there are also now a large number of papers and studies that try to elicit MPCs through surveys which ask consumers how to state how they would respond in hypothetical situations. So we present consumers with a hypothetical windfall, some transitory income, and ask them how they would change their spending, or a hypothetical loss, some transitory loss of income, and ask them how they would change their spending. These questions, why would we want to do that way? Well, if we're working with covariance of consumption and income shocks, we have to worry a great deal about separating transitory from permanent shocks. If we're working with natural experiments, we have to have a natural experiment. We have to have an appropriate control group. If we elicit MPCs through surveys with hypothetical situations, one thing is that we can get an MPC for each consumer that responds to the survey, and so we can learn not just about the average MPC in an economy, but about the distribution of MPCs, which can be important for policy making and for understanding the distribution of straitened circumstances, as I explained a moment ago. Another thing is, we would be worried about the generalizability of MPCs estimated, from, say, from a natural experiment that occurs in a downturn to policy making in a boom, for example. So there's lots of external validity questions, and if we can learn about the MPC through hypothetical experiments, survey experiments, we can conduct those surveys in different places at different times, at different points in the business cycle. So that's another reason why I think there's been a great attraction to recovering the MPC in this way. Okay. So because of those reasons, such questions are now asked in a lot of surveys. The well-known survey of consumer expectations run by the Fed in the US, comparable surveys run by the European Central Bank and the Italian Central Bank and the Bank of England. So, these questions are now quite prevalent. So when you do this, what you discover is a number of puzzles. Okay, and so I want to just highlight a couple, and they're really going to be the focus. The question in our work is whether we can make any progress on these puzzles using open format questions. So one is the substantial heterogeneity within groups of consumers defined by liquidity. So as I mentioned earlier, consumer theory tells us that for a liquid household, a household with liquid assets, and a fairly long time horizon, the MPC should be very small. Basically, the annuity value of the shock, which is going to be less than 5%, very close to zero. but for households who are credit constrained, we would expect the MPC to be close to 1. Okay. And in the data that we collect, it's typically the case that there is a correlation between reported MPCs and liquidity measures. But that correlation is not nearly as strong as we might expect. And in particular, we find liquid households, or apparently liquid households, with high MPCs, and apparently illiquid households with low MPCs, which goes against what theory would predict. And more generally, substantial heterogeneity in the MPC that's unrelated to unobservables, which is a point emphasized by Fuster et al. We do see lots of heterogeneity in the data, but it doesn't seem to be explainable by theory, or even just in an atheoretic way by observable characteristics of the data. Another puzzle that we see is gain-loss asymmetries. So, for small shocks, we would typically expect the MPC out of a loss and the MPC out of a gain to be quite similar, but we don't see that. And we often see much larger MPCs out of losses. So these puzzles might reflect measurement problems, right? So we may be misclassifying households by liquidity. It could be that households that we think are illiquid are quite liquid because although they don't have financial assets, they have other sources of liquidity. It could be that respondents are misclassifying spending or saving. So I know from focus groups that I did years ago in the UK that households sometimes think of what an economist would think of as saving as spending. So for example, households paying off a credit card. As an economist, I think of when you use your credit card, you're dissaving, and if you pay your credit card off, you're saving. But households would sometimes report paying off their credit card as spending. Okay, so those types of misclassifications could lead to high MPCs or spuriously high MPCs. Households that are actually saving by paying down consumer credit report that they're spending, when in fact, by the economist definition, they're not. Another possibility is that the standard model just omits important motives or important aspects of behavior, for example, mental accounting. And so what we want to do to explore in this project is the extent to which open format questions could help discriminate between these explanations or suggest novel explanations that we hadn't previously thought of. So what did we do? So we conducted earlier this year, in fact, a survey of about 3,000 UK consumers. We asked a standard closed format set of MPC elicitation questions taken from the literature. So we basically followed questions that are very similar to those in the Fuster, Kaplan, and Safar paper, which I also used, and Peter was also involved in the COVID survey from Understanding Society. So this is a well-known question. But what we did that was new was we added open format follow-up questions. And those follow-up questions asked respondents what money would be spent on, or if they told us they had a high MPC, or what unspent money would be used for if they told us they had a low MPC, or what would be done to cover a loss if they told us that they wouldn't cut spending in the face of a transitory income loss. And we asked them why. And I'm going to give you some more detail on that. And then we processed these open format questions, responses with a text analysis approach. So what did we find? Well, we did find some evidence of measurement issues. In particular, we did find that some low liquidity individuals reported, alternative ways of covering a loss that suggests that they're more liquid than you would think from just looking at their assets or how many months of income they have in liquid assets. We did find some evidence of saving spending confusion. We found some people who reported that they would, when we asked them what they would spend on, a high MPC household consumer reported they would spend on paying down their credit cards, which we think of as saving rather than spending. But equally, we found people who reported low MPCs, and then when we asked what they would do with the money, they described spending. So there seems to be confusion, a little bit of confusion both ways. But importantly, these measurement errors, measurement problems, these misclassifications do not seem to be prevalent enough to explain the puzzles, right? So they don't seem to be the big story. Put another way, it seems that the puzzling, somewhat puzzling patterns of MPC heterogeneity in the data seem to be genuine. On the other hand, we found evidence of mental accounting behavior, okay? In particular, among the puzzling high liquidity, high MPC consumers, particularly when they're high MPC in the gain scenario. That is, we tell them they've got a transitory income gain, hypothetical transitory income gain, and ask them how they would respond. They report they would adjust their spending on durables and luxuries. Sorry, that should say luxuries, not durables. They're more likely to have a low MPC in the loss scenario. And when we ask them why they would spend, they are much more likely to suggest that they view payments as a bonus or an opportunity to treat themselves. So there's a lot of language that's suggestive of sort of mental accounting, where people think of a windfall as separate from their regular finances. We also found that low liquidity, low MPC consumers often mention paying down debts. And so the somewhat surprising low MPCs among low liquidity consumers seem to be associated with strong debt aversion. And so our sort of conclusion from this is that open format questions with text analysis delivered useful insights for measurement and about consumer behavior. So we think it's worth thinking about asking open format questions in more contexts. So that's kind of the overview of what we did. And in the time remaining, I'll try to go through some of the details for you. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about the data. So this is an experimental project, and so we used a quota sample of UK residents from a large survey company and conducted a web survey using Qualtrics. So this is not a probability sample in the way that, for example, PSID or Understanding Society is, but for our purposes, just exploring how well these questions work, we think it was entirely suitable and allowed us to get into the field quickly. We conducted 2 small pilots to work on our question design before fielding the main survey. The survey begins with sort of standard questions about demographics and financial circumstances and consumption capabilities. And then we use MPC elicitation questions following Fuster et al. Each respondent was posed a gain and a loss scenario, hypothetical. We randomized the order in which respondents saw the gain and the loss scenario. In the paper, we do some testing for order effects. We find some order effects. I think that's a bit orthogonal to the story that I want to talk about today. But if you're interested, we're happy to share those results with you. We also, there's some evidence of size effects in the literature. So the size of both the gain and the loss for a given respondent, the size of the gain, income gain and income loss was the same. But we randomized that size across respondents. But a fairly standard or very standard MPC elicitation question, which I'll show you in a sec. And then we had the open format follow-up. So we ask a series of open format questions. We enforced a minimum of a 12 character response, but we prompted and urged respondents to give us as much detail as possible. Sorry, apologies. Okay, so here's just the way that the standard question works. So we ask people to consider a hypothetical situation where they receive a one-time payment of a windfall today. So windfall there is a placeholder which will either be £2,500 or £500. So they don't see the word windfall as a one-time payment of £500 or a one-time payment of £2,500. We'd like to know whether this extra income would cause you to change your spending and financial decisions anyway over the next 3 months. And we asked them, in a closed format, whether they would spend more, whether they spend the same, whether they spend less. If they said they would increase their spending, we asked them how much. If they indicated they would decrease their spending, we asked them how much. Okay, so this is very standard. And then we had the follow-up questions. So in the gain scenario, if they said they would spend more, we asked them what they would spend on. An open format question about that. Again, the full survey instrument is an appendix in the paper, which is available. If they reported an MPC less than 1, so if they said they would spend more, but when they told us how much more they would spend, it was less than the 500 or 2,500 transitory income increase, we asked them what they would use the unspent funds for, and then for both spending and use of unspent funds, we asked them why. In the loss scenario, if they indicated they would spend less, we asked them what they would cut back on. If the amount they said they would cut back indicated an MPC less than 1, we asked them what else they would do to cover the loss. And again, in both cases, we asked them why. So those are the whats and the whys. The data collection happened in May of this year, and we had we obtained a sample of 3,502 respondents. Okay, we have an analysis sample that's 10% smaller. There are a small number of exclusions. There are some people that appear to do these surveys from outside the UK. We excluded those. There's some people who appear to do these surveys multiple times. So we'd have somebody from the same IP address with identical demographics, and then we would delete both of their cases from the sample. We asked, at the end of the survey, we asked some open format questions about how clear or unclear respondents found the survey. Those are quite helpful in our pilots. They gave us clues on how to revise our questions. But in the final survey of respondents, nevertheless reported that the survey questions were very unclear, and there were only a small number of those. We dropped them from our analysis sample. Some people respond to such web surveys on a mobile device, on their phone. If they did that and it looked like they were, because of the speed at which they were doing it, that they were using predictive text for their open format answers, we deleted them from our analysis sample. We deleted a very small number of respondents with MPCs in excess of 10. And we deleted the 5% of individuals with the very fastest responses to the open-ended question, the open format questions. And that left us with an analysis sample, which underlies what I'll show you today, about 3,137 cases. Okay. So as I explained previously, the key puzzles that we're interested in have to do with high MPCs among high liquidity consumers and low MPCs among low liquidity consumers. And so we had to assign respondents to high and low liquidity groups. We take a very standard approach here. One of the financial circumstances question asks if they have resources to cover 3 months of expenses if they lost their main source of income. And if they said yes, they're a high liquidity consumer, and if they said no, they're a low liquidity consumer. This is pretty standard. People either use questions like this, or in surveys where liquid assets are measured, a similar 3 months of income criteria is often used. This measure correlates well with measures of financial security and consumption capability that we also measured in the survey. As a robustness check, we repeated our analysis using latent class analysis and a large number of financial security and consumption capability measures to classify people into high and low liquidity groups. And that robustness check is reported in the paper. Okay, so here's just how it goes. Here are the high and low liquidity groups, and so the high liquidity groups are, much more likely to own their homes, much more likely to report that loans are not a burden, much more likely to report that they saved. Okay, so this is kind of a standard finding. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is just to show you that our survey replicates the puzzles that in the literature that I referred to earlier, that these patterns of heterogeneity in elicited MPCs that other people have found before. Larger responses to losses than gains, apparently liquid households with high MPCs and apparently illiquid households with low MPCs. So, this figure shows, okay, so there are two graphs here. I'm showing the average MPC by group. The two graphs or two panels are by the randomized size. So half of the sample got a gain or loss of 500 pounds. Half the sample got a gain or loss of 2,500 pounds. There are 4 bars in each graph. And so we've divided the responses by whether households were high liquidity or low liquidity, defined as I just described, and whether they were responding to a loss scenario or a gain scenario. Remember that everyone in the survey gets both the loss and gain scenario in a random order. So the comparisons across gain and loss are within subject comparisons. The comparisons across the size of the gain or loss, the 500 versus 2,500, are between subject comparisons, because we randomize that across subjects. And the comparisons across high and low liquidity groups are between subject comparisons, because consumers are either high liquidity or low liquidity, depending on their response to the liquidity question. So what you can see in this graph is that the average MPCs are much higher for small transitory income shocks than for large transitory income shocks, and that's consistent with the previous literature. You could see, because the dark blue and dark brown bars are much larger, that that MPCs are larger in the loss scenario than in the gain scenario. And again, that's consistent with the previous literature. And you can also see that there's a correlation between liquidity and MPCs. So MPCs are higher in the high liquidity, that is blue bars, lower for the high liquidity consumers, the blue bars, than they are for the low liquidity consumers. So, theory would sort of predict that MPCs should be close to 0 for the blue bars, and you can see that they're not, particularly in the loss scenario, and that MPCs should be close to 1 for the low liquidity or credit constrained consumers, and you can see that they're not, but of course there is a correlation with liquidity. And so all of that is consistent with the past literature and just confirming that the data that we collected replicates the puzzles that we want to try to explain. Peter,
Tom,
how much?
You got 6 or 7 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are just distributions of MPCs again, by the size, by gain and loss. And, all I want you to note here is that, the place where that we do the low liquidity, the high liquidity consumers are the solid outlined bars with no coloring, and the low liquidity consumers are the dotted outline bars with blue coloring. And what you could see is that we do have high liquidity consumers with high MPCs, both in loss and gain scenario, maybe particularly so in the loss scenario, but in both scenarios. And we do have low liquidity consumers with low MPCs in all scenarios. And that's the sort of puzzling heterogeneity that we're interested in exploring. So as I described, we're going to do some text analysis. So there are 2 steps here. The first is pre-processing, and we're following a procedure that's very similar to Ferrario and Stancheva. So we, in a first step, remove punctuation. And this is the pre-processing here was all automated. So we remove punctuation numbers, excess spaces, special characters, and common stop words. We lemmatized the remaining words, which means we remove inflections. We separately process the what and why responses, and okay, and that's all the pre-processing. And then we developed a list of topics and keywords, or n-grams. So the developing the list of topics we did manually, and I'll come back to that at the end. Okay. And so basically what happens is, treat myself to a few days down the pub and nice food becomes treat day pub, nice food. And then, we developed a set of topics, and under each topic, keywords, and then we record the incidence or the prevalence of those keywords across the open format responses we got from consumers. And I'll show you that in a second. And so, these are sort of fun. These word clouds show the prevalence of different bigrams, so two-word pairs that occurred after we pre-processed the data. So, for example, what individuals would spend on, and you can see treat, a family, comes out as prominent, but also pay off, which is one of the things that we think is probably not spending, but rather saving. Okay, so I've got there some other, I'll skip over them, look at other things. So to do the topic analysis, what we did is we defined high MPC as an MPC greater than 0.25. And we're going to compare topic frequencies across the four groups defined by liquidity and MPC. So what we're doing is we're looking at what people are doing and why they're doing it in different groups, where we're defining the groups by high liquidity, low liquidity, high MPC, low MPC. And the two groups in teal, the high liquidity individual with high MPCs and the low liquidity consumers with low MPCs, are the ones that I've described as puzzling from the point of view of a standard consumer theory model. Okay, so for example, so here's the topic analysis for what people would spend money on in a gain scenario. And you can see, we have pay off debt. So we have a substantial number of people saying they would pay off debt, even though that's not spending from our point of view. I think it's interesting to look at the bottom row, where you can see that the high liquidity, high MPC individuals, who are the light blue bar, are much more likely to respond to cite spending on luxuries and treats, whereas the low liquidity, high MPC group, which are the pink bar, are much more likely to cite spending on essentials. Okay. And then, here we have, the frequency of different motives, okay, where again we're classifying keywords to topics. So the interesting one here is unexpected bonus, which is are sort of all kinds of words associated with treating an unexpected bonus differently from other kinds of money. And so this is sort of the mental accounting category, and you can see that this is very prevalent. Again, the light blue bar is the high liquidity, high MPC group. Among those people who are liquid, should be able to smooth the transitory shock, but spend it, they're very often giving mental accounting type responses. Okay. This is how people would cut back on a liquidity, same kind of analysis. Okay, again, mentioning different motives from response to a loss by liquidity group and MPC. So people here with low MPCs, sometimes cite that they don't like debt. So that's some incidence of debt aversion. So that's what the topic analysis looks like. Let me just, I know I only have a few minutes left, so let me just show you this table, and then I'll conclude. So, we're trying to figure out, who are the puzzling guys? So it's puzzling when people have high liquidity, but they have a high MPC. And it's somewhat puzzling when people have low liquidity, but a low MPC. And so what we did is we start, what I call baseline is when we classify people into those four groups. So about 10% of the sample has high liquidity and a high MPC. And then what happens is if we reclassify those that had who have low MPCs in response to a loss, but mention many other coping mechanisms. Said they could borrow money from the family, or they had real assets that they could sell, or that they had a labor supply margin in which they could adjust. And we reclassify those as high liquidity. So that's the first change we make. And that makes very little difference to the incidence of these two puzzling groups. And then we exclude those who report spending in other uses for the money. So if they told us they weren't going to spend very much, but then when we asked them what they would do with the money, they cited things that we would interpret spending, we excluded from the sample. Again, that does very little. There were, as you saw, people who misclassified debt repayment as spending in the survey, and revealed this in their open format responses. If we reclassify them as, exclude them from the sample, again, the incidence doesn't change very much. The thing that really sort of moves at least the fraction of the incidence of high liquidity with high MPC column, the right-hand column, is when we exclude people who give mental accounting type explanations. And so that sort of cuts that group in half. And so this seems to be, this is why we conclude that these sort of non-standard behavioral considerations seem to be more of an explanation of the puzzling heterogeneity MPCs than the types of measurement errors that we thought might be the problem. So let me skip ahead to the conclusion, if I can have 1 or 2 more minutes. So what do I conclude from, again, this is we ran the survey in May. I moved to Michigan over the summer. It's the first time that any of us have presented it. But our analysis so far leads us to think the following. First, that patterns of MPC heterogeneity documented in the literature appear to be genuine. So it doesn't seem that you can explain all the high MPC, high liquidity folks by, as being either misclassified, they're actually, credit constrained, but we've misclassified them, or they're actually not spending, but they think they are, they're actually paying off debts. That doesn't seem to be the case. Those patterns seem to be genuine. Behaviorally, what we hear from people in the open format responses is mental accounting is important and debt inversion is important. And so these appear to be important aspects of consumer decision making, but of course not everybody cites those, right? So I think there's an important heterogeneity in the way in which people behave. This is perhaps not unsurprising. I mean, 20 years ago, Martin Browning and I wrote a paper in which we did sort of calculations that showed that the utility costs of failing to smooth small transitory income shocks are very small. And so it wouldn't be so surprising if people, had heuristics that led them to, for example, splurge when they had a small transitory income shock. We also have some conclusions for survey design. And the main one is just that these open format questions seem useful. From a measurement point of view, essentially what we're doing here is like there's a long-standing method in survey research of the cognitive debrief, where you take a small sample of individuals and you ask them questions about why they gave the answers they gave, or how they understood the question after they completed the survey. But that's usually done on a qualitative basis. So it turns up problems, but it doesn't give you a sense of the incident or the prevalence of those problems. This sort of allows us to do something like a cognitive debrief at scale. And from the point of view of economic behavior, it allows us to uncover motives that we might not have asked about, right? So existing surveys of MPCs don't typically ask about mental accounting. And so we think that, going forward, it may be time to shift the balance a bit between closed format and open format questions. And I think the obvious next step for us is, as I explained, we automated the pre-processing of the data, but we manually did the topic analysis. And so I think the obvious thing and we did that because the brevity of the responses and the number of respondents made it feasible. And we felt that a lot of the responses were fairly context specific. And so our first pass was to do it manually. But an obvious thing to do here is to explore the extent to which we can use machine learning to automate the topic analysis. Okay, so I can't remember if I said this at the beginning. I should acknowledge that the data collection that I just described was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, but as always, the interpretation of the data and the opinions expressed are those of the authors alone. And there's my email address. I would be very happy to hear from you if you'd like a copy of the paper or if you have comments on this work and how we should develop it. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Tom. So we'll now go over to Ellis for the discussion. So if Ellis, you want to try sharing your slides.
So I think I have to stop.
It looks like everything's working as it should.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Can I just check if you can see me in my slides?
We can see your slides perfectly.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation and an opportunity to discuss sort of a more innovative approach to understanding consumption behaviour. My name is Ellis Monaghan. I'm Head of Household Income and Wealth Microstats at the ONS. And here at the ONS, we use our household financial surveys to understand the financial well-being of households to help users understand how society is managing and to assess the effects of policy changes. So exploring any new research like this that might help explain some of the behaviours and opinions that are underlying our aggregate survey estimates is therefore always of interest to us. So before examining the paper and possible extensions, I just very briefly wanted to touch on the motivation of the work and the place within the literature. So existing literature tends to focus on measuring the marginal propensity to consume for individuals through the questions asking respondents how their spending, saving and debt would change in response to hypothetical windfalls and losses. And studies have provided insight into the characteristics of those with different MPCs, including of their liquidity, and identified differences, as we heard earlier, or diversity within groups of consumers with similar levels of liquidity. So the paper discussed today provides insight into these differences and explores the behaviour that's not always captured by our standard models or indeed our standard survey questions. It complements this existing analysis, though, of the current financial well-being of households, reported through our household finance surveys and often through the questions with response options. So, for example, ONS previous analysis of the Wealth and Asset Survey has considered the extent to which individuals can sustain an income shock by comparing a loss of income, employment income, for a fixed period of time to the amount of household savings that individuals report. We've also considered the Opinions and Lifestyle Survey to look at the current attitudes and experiences of individuals and report on how cost of living has changed compared with a month ago or longer. We also considered the actions and behaviours as a result of changes in the cost of living and therefore can identify groups within the population who we think are the most vulnerable. So the research discussed today, seeking to understand why individuals with similar levels of liquidity can have different spending and saving behaviours, is really helpful in helping us interpret these other survey results. So to recap on the method, the approach taken involves posing questions designed to elicit MPCs. This includes asking individuals how they would adjust their spending, so whether they would at all, and if so, by how much, after receiving an unexpected gain, or if they found themselves unexpectedly worse off. Respondents were then asked to list what they'd spend their money on, or what they cut back spending on, and how they would use any unspent funds. All respondents were then asked to give their reasons why they would use the money in the ways that they stated. And so their analysis showed a similar puzzle to that reported in the literature, that while on average those with less liquidity have higher MPCs, there are also many low liquidity individuals that have an MPC of 0. But what's new with this analysis is the next stage. So the free text responses were analysed by grouping together similar responses into topics, capturing behaviours and capturing motives. The frequency of different topics across groups of respondents split by their liquidity levels were analysed. And the analysis that found that low liquidity individuals were more likely to report using the windfall to pay off debt, regardless of whether they reported a low or high MPC. It also found evidence of mental accounting. So looking only at those with a high MPC, the research found high liquidity individuals reported they could adjust spending on luxuries or other topics, suggesting they view the windfall as a treat, while low liquidity individuals reported that they would adjust essentials and mentioned topics suggesting that the payment relaxed some sort of financial constraint. The research also identified measurement issues that may contribute to the differences in reported MPCs. So firstly, some of the respondents reported that they'd sell belongings, borrow from friends or family, or work more to compensate for a loss. This suggests their liquidity may be higher than captured by liquid financial assets and indeed by capture by our traditional household financial surveys. Secondly, the research found some misclassification of saving, such as by classifying debt or credit card repayments as spending. And as a result, the measured MPC would be higher than if it only included what we might see as spending. So these findings together demonstrate the value in using free text analysis to understand differences in reported MPCs. Where standard models focus only on spending, saving, and repaying debt, this approach looks beyond to behaviours not always captured by our survey. Response options, such as the ability to borrow from friends or family, I've already mentioned, and provides unique insights into consumer behaviour. It adds new insight into the motives behind reported MPCs and the interpretation of responses to questions on household finances. So there are some really useful lessons for future survey design, some of which we haven't covered in too much detail, but around the ordering of gain and loss questions, around the values chosen for hypothetical situations, so that loss or windfall, and how that is relative to an individual's liquidity or income, and the wording of questions or accompanying definitions of financial terminology that are used in our surveys. The ONS household financial surveys currently use response options when asking individuals about, for example, what they would do with money received as a gift or an inheritance within the Wealth and Asset Survey. And our response options list is modified when interviewers provide feedback that suggests there's common responses that don't currently feature in our list. But an alternative approach to avoid that would be to use this free text approach. So we could allow respondents to use their own words to describe how they might use an inheritance and use text analysis techniques to identify the key words or bring out the underlying themes, as was done here. So this research is adding to the literature, supporting open-ended questions being used in household financial surveys. But when thinking about extending the work, there are further opportunities to understand differences in MPCs. So, for example, this work defined a loss as either being a reduction in savings and increase in debt, or a reduction in income. But those three options might be considered as being quite different situations with different longer-term impacts. For example, due to additional accrued interest or interest lost, and links with attitudes towards work and well-being that you might expect to also influence consumer behaviour. So exploring the differences in the MPCs by the type of loss could also be of interest and help explain some of the differences. The analysis focused on the behaviour of individuals in the 3 months following the loss or windfall, which means that those that would put the money towards saving for a specific event and to spend the money, say, on a holiday in 6 to 12 months, were treated differently to those who were going to spend the money within 3 months. Similarly, if the windfall or loss is a surprise rather than planned, you might expect to see different behaviours, and exploring these could yield further interesting results. And finally, as was noted today, there are alternative approaches to the analysis of free text. The approach taken in this paper was to remove punctuation, remove inflections, and group keywords together into topics. It also found that the meaning of different terms tended to be highly sensitive to the context, and so I understand there was some manual checking of the data. So this implies that the approach might need to be reconsidered if you were scaling up to a survey, for example, the size of the ONS household financial surveys. So extending the research, particularly for larger scale surveys, could consider an alternative natural language processing based approach. These methods code words or phrases as vectors, allowing them to be treated as points in space. And then similar phrases or words can be estimated by exploring how close or far apart these phrases are. ONS has previously used this method to do topic modelling, which identifies the underlying themes or topic within text. So here, the team at ONS coded phrases using the LDA approach to allocate text to points in space, and we're able to use this to identify key distinct topics or themes reported in a free text question on the Opinions and Lifestyle survey. The objective was to identify the themes underlying the free text responses, which highlight the perceptions and lived experience that respondents had of the rising cost of living. And the themes were then able to be summarised using the underlying data. Extending beyond the household finances topic, ONS and particularly our data science campus also have experience using NLP techniques to extract supply chain information from news articles to better understand global supply chains, to understand attitudes to climate change by identifying underlying themes in responses to questions asking for opinions, and to understand perceptions of the COVID-19 vaccine. We're also currently looking into the text in job adverts to understand more about the types of roles that are being demanded. So to conclude, the research presents a really innovative approach to a highly topical puzzle within the household finances space, but the lessons for survey design around the definitions used, ordering of questions, and opportunities to use free text questions to capture differences within groups of individuals extends beyond the household finances topic. The extensions or further considerations that I've very briefly mentioned would all aim to further understand the differences in attitudes and behaviours underlying the reported NPCs. I'm going to be really interested in seeing how this research progresses, and then indeed more generally how the use of free text questions is picked up by surveys going forward.
Thanks very much, Alice. It's really interesting to hear how the ONS could use and is using some of these advanced text analysis methods to really enhance what they're getting from existing surveys and new surveys. So thanks very much for that. I think we could probably go straight to Q&A unless Tom feels he wants to respond to anything that Alice says. We can go straight to Q&A.
Sure, that's fine.
So we've got 3 questions that I can see so far. So the chronological order of when they appeared, the first is from Joe Grice. So he asks, actually, Joe, are you there? Do you want to unmute yourself? If you're able. I can hear something happening. So I'll tell you what, I'll read out the question. What Joe says, Tom, from a theoretical point of view, from the point of view of the theoretical predictions against which you're looked at the evidence, it makes a difference whether spending is on durables and non-durables. The latter are more like investment. How are you handling the distinction, either in the closed or open format questions?
Yeah, no, Joe's right in that, investments are in a sense like saving. And so I think, this literature hasn't been very good about separating out non-durable and durable consumption. We do pick that up as a topic, durable spending is that high. So if I'm not sharing the slides anymore, but durables are one of the things that we see spending on amongst high liquidity, high MPC consumers, and that's again another explanation, one that I didn't emphasize perhaps as much as I should have, and that's a good point. So I thank Joe for that.
Great. So there's another
questions in the chat as well as in the Q&A.
Yes. I spotted that. So yes, there's a question from David Johnson, or a couple of questions. Is it possible that pay down debt is really spending? So pay credit card debt to spend more next month? And can the answers examine this? And then a second follow-up question. Most studies using reported NPCs find a larger bimodal distribution, more 100% than your results. Any thoughts why there are differences? So 2-part question there from David.
Yeah, so I'll start with the hard one. So the first question, I don't have a very good answer to. if we thought you were paying, if you're paying down, we're asking here about a 3-month interval, right? If you're paying down your credit cards in order to spend outside of that 3-month interval, then I think that's clearly saving. If you're paying down your credit cards to spend within the 3-month interval, it's not clear how people would answer the question, right? Because we asked them if they're going to increase spending in the next 3 months. So, you think you would record both the credit card pay down mistakenly, but then you would also record the, the other spending that you're planning to do within the 3-month interval. So I think we're just sort of, it's just tricky because we have to commit to an interval. And I think things that it's very hard to to reveal what's happening inside of that interval. But it's certainly something to think about further. So I will think about further and whether we could kind of, in some future survey, design things in a way to get at that. On the second question, I have more to say. So Peter and I and other co-authors, in fact, have a second paper on NPCs, which I didn't present today. Because there's a surprising, David is correct that many papers that elicit NPCs get many more NPCs one than we do, and get higher average NPCs than we do. Our numbers are very similar to those that are in the Fuster, Kaplan, and Safar paper, and very similar to when we fielded the same question in the COVID Understanding Society COVID study. And the distinction here is that we're asking a two-part question. We first ask people whether they would increase spending, keep spending the same, or decrease spending. And then once they say what they would do, we ask them by how much, if they say they would increase or decrease spending. And that format is the format in the Fuster, Kaplan, Safar paper, and the format in the COVID study. Many of the other papers in the literature ask what I call a one-shot question. So they just ask people, how much would you increase your spending? And it looks like that format leads to higher reported NPCs, and we hypothesize that it does so because it primes people to think that they should report some spending. And so Peter and I have another paper where we use the innovation panel in Understanding Society, and we randomly allocated people. So we did a survey experiment. We randomly allocated to people either to the two-step format or the single-step format. And we find indeed that there's a big difference in NPC distributions depending on that particular design choice of the question. So David, I think the answer is that the papers that you're referring to use the single format question. And we have experimental evidence that leads to higher NPCs, higher reported NPCs. We hypothesize that has to do with priming. And in ongoing work, we're trying to sort of tie the experimental results to other results to try to establish which format is actually better. And I could tell you more about that offline.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'll just word to the administrators. I'd be happy to allow everyone to just unmute themselves at this point if people want to ask questions, or if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat.
Peter, I think there's another question in the chat.
There is, yes. Just inviting more people if you want to talk. We do have some more time for questions. Yes, so this is a question from my colleague across the corridor, Gautam. So he says, thanks both for the interesting talk and discussion. I wonder whether individuals were able to go back and change their answer to the stated MP question after thinking about the follow-up questions, or if these questions are asked after the initial survey is complete. On the cognitive debrief point, it seems as though asking the follow-ups and allowing the former would also reduce measurement error and improve accuracy of participants' stated MPC, since they'd be forced to think through what they would spend the money on in more detail.
Okay, so thanks for the question. I think it's a very good one. So here, they could not go back and change their previous answer. So they gave us their answer, and then they gave their explanation. In previous work with colleagues at Essex, working on understanding society, we ran experiments with summary screens, and this has also been done in a consumer survey conducted by Rand in California, where people describe what they would do, and then they're presented back what they would do, what they said they would do, and then are asked if they'd like to revise their answers. And so we did this with income, because the standard way of measuring income, which, for example, understanding society, the Canberra group standard that I think many household finance surveys follow, is to ask people about each individual that answers in a household that answers the survey, to ask them about each category of income, and then to aggregate over types of income and individuals. And so then we were feeding back people totals and asking if they wanted to revise. And then we've also experimented with asking people different consumption categories, and then feeding them back totals and asking them if they want to revise. And we find that feeding back those summary screens improves data in exactly the way that you hypothesize. If people go back and they, outliers are reduced, people give us better answers. We didn't do that here. We were experimenting with what we could learn from the open format questions, but this idea of using open format questions and then allowing people to revise is an interesting one. It sort of combines two of the things that I've done, and so I certainly will record that for the future. I think it's an interesting possibility, right? Rather than the sort of summary screens and then just presenting people with some information, asking if they want to revise, asking people to reflect, and then asking if they want to revise. That would be an interesting experiment to run. So thank you for that suggestion.
Yes, thanks very much. And just to reiterate the point that Sarah has made in the chat, that if you raise your hand, we will allow you to unmute yourself, and you can ask a question. So David just responded with a quick follow-up to your answer. I've always thought that the papers finding NPCs increasing with wealth is due to the outliers. The NPCs equal one. And yeah, no, I think our work speaks to that. Victoria asked a kind of a procedural question, so wondering whether we'll be able to share the references mentioned in the papers during the slide. I believe the slide and soon, hopefully, a paper will be available after the talk, where you'll be able to see all the references we made during the talk. I'll just check.
People can email me if they'd like to be sent the paper, and or you, I guess, Peter.
Yes.
The paper has a full set of references. Given the limitations of time, I didn't go over the literature, but there is a large literature, and the citations in the paper are complete.
Thanks very much. Okay, so and then the Q&A, Jill Leyland's asked a question. Could this technique be used to learn more about consumers' reactions to, for example, changes in relative prices between different brands of product? Very interesting. For example, where consumers are or not relatively price sensitive.
So Jill, thank you, Jill. You didn't miss anything. We didn't talk about relative prices changes earlier in the talk. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the general point that I'm certainly thinking about as somebody who works on surveys is, where can we, given the rapidly improving tools that we have, and Ellis talked about all the things that are happening at the data science campus at ONF. Given the rapidly improving tools we have, where can we apply open format questions? And I think it's sort of wide open. Asking about, why people made particular consumption choices is certainly a possibility. I'd have to think quite a lot about the details, but I don't see why not.
Indeed. Okay, I'm just looking back and forth. So it looks like there are no further questions. If someone else wants to ask a question, they can raise their hand now. Otherwise, it might be time for us to bring this session to a close. So I will thank our speaker, Tom Crossley from Michigan. I'll thank our discussant, Alice Monaghan from the ONS, and I'll thank all of you for coming and asking your interesting questions. And we hope to see you next time for the next ESCoE economic measurement webinar. Thanks very much.